Good morning and welcome everyone. Thanks for being here. Welcome to the third annual Scholars to Forum at the Georgia Library here in Boston. And greetings to everyone. I don't know if they started seeing us or no, everybody who is joining us online. Today we will be talking about the one topic that I'm sure all of us has always been interested in. That is our favorite topic, people and their stories. Each one of our presenters today has a unique narrative that they will share with us. They come from very different backgrounds, and I'm certain we will all learn something about part of the history that we know before. They're going to talk to us about their lives, their work, their families, their faith, their ethnicities, and their countries of origin, and how all these has impacted their relation to this country and to the world. We will hear about personal challenges and victories, but also different methodologies to better understand how we can share our own personal stories and expand on that and why that matters at all. In the process, I hope one thing that we will all learn and take away from today is that people, wherever they come from or whatever they believe in, are not that different from each other. And there's always something to learn from each person. This is a very great opportunity for me to be here and to connect with all of you students and at the same time collaborate once again with one of my favorite organizations, the World Affairs Council, here at this beautiful venue. It's also my first time to be here, and I am, as a new immigrant, new to all the American culture and history, so I will learn a lot. And today we have a great, incredible lineup for you. We will start with Stephen Hammond. He's going to talk to us about genealogy. Genealogy is a field that is making incredible advances these days. Everybody is talking about genealogy, and it will help us to understand how we can connect our past with current days and future. He will tell us about his own family, his part of his story, and how that is part of this nation's narrative, and he will lead us through things that made him interested in this science. Then we will hear from Kani Khaloum. He will share his story of being a Kurdish and his journey from Turkey to America and what led him to become a great advocate for Kurdish fellows and share with us their struggles and their wishes. Also, we will hear from Indra Acharya, and he will tell us also his personal story about how he became a young Nepalese refugee and also at the same time made it through becoming a scholar at Georgetown and his tales of triumph and victories and overcoming steep obstacles. Mariah Losell, the curator at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, is with us. She will tell us about how to incorporate some of these important and often untold stories in this country and communicate them in a more meaningful way. But before all of these great stories, let's hear from our host, General George Washington.
Well, thank you, madam. Thank you for your kindness. Good day to all. I hope you're enjoying your day so far at my farms. Son, you're looking like you've seen a ghost. I assure you it is not the case. It's a great honor to have the opportunity to speak with you. You know, I am struck by the title of this confabulation, Scholars to Leaders. I am not a scholar. In fact, I totally lack any formal education whatsoever. so I'm a bit jealous of each and every one of you. And I was ambitious, but I never set out to become a leader per se. My story is a rather unusual one. In fact, I have been thinking about something that I had writ recently about the story of this country. And what I had writ was that if historiographers will deign to tell the story of the formation of this country, it will be given the epithet of fiction, and it will not be believed. My life is intrinsically connected to that story. So when I think about it, it's rather remarkable. At my age, my hair, we spin back, we think about the past. I was a happy, loyal British subject. Think about the arc of my life. And here in British America, we had all the rights, we had all the privileges, we had all the franchises of Englishmen, at least the ones that were important to us. And this meant that we governed ourselves. As a matter of fact, the crown and the ministers of the king, they left us alone here in British America for nigh on 150 years, going back to the 1600s, which means we really governed ourselves. It means we adjudicated our own cases in our own courtrooms. It means we raised our own monies when we needed monies. And this would come to bite the King of England on the back of his neck subsequently. I become an officer and I fight in the French and Indian War. I fight for my king and my country. But I am treated rather poorly because I am a Virginia colonial officer. My pay, the pay of my soldiers, far lower than British regular soldiers. My authority, it was in question at all times. I became ultimately a colonel, the commander-in-chief of all the forces of Virginia, but a colonel, which is a pretty high rank, it's just below brigadier general. My orders could be countered by a lieutenant or a captain in the British regular army. And all of this, it is because of the way our lordly masters over in Great Britain at the time thought about us. They looked down at us. They considered us backwater provincials. They considered us lowly American colonials. Be that as it may, I did my duty. I persevered. And those two words, perseverance and duty, they are intrinsically connected in my character. If I leave you with one message on this day, it is of the value of perseverance, keeping on, and finding your mission and being wed to that mission. That is the sense of duty. And those two things kept me going for the king. But we then suffered insult and injury. Starting in 1764, we are hit with the Sugar Act, we are hit with the Quartering Act, we are hit with the Currency Act, we are hit with the infamous Stamp Act, 119 paragraphs of taxes. Why all of this? Why all of this insult and injury? This war that I fought against the French and Indian War, it bankrupted Great Britain. Bankrupted it. The king, he went to his counting room, he almost fell over with apoplexy because it was nigh on empty. And so he said to his ministers, do something about this. And his ministers put their heads together. They come back to the king and they say, Your Majesty, we just finished fighting this very expensive war against the French. Most of the cost of that war was spent in British America. Let us turn to the American colonials, and we will refill the treasury of Great Britain. I tell you this because my story and the story of the formation of this country, it is critical that you understand that the French and Indian War and the cost thereof was directly causative of the War of American Independence, and it had everything to do with money. And so, again, for 11 years, from 1764, we are hit, our freedoms are usurped, our liberties are stripped from us, and the crown reaches into our pockets and into our purses in ways that they had never done before until we cannot take it any longer. And we meet in Philadelphia. We are citizens of 13. Well, Georgia doesn't send anyone, but they sent a letter of strong support, so I include them in the number. We are citizens of 13 separate what? Oh, I'm a general. I don't like it when you fall into my trap. You're right. That was our legal status. We were subjects of the crown. But you need to change the way you think about your history. We were citizens of 13 separate countries. My country was Virginia. We were meeting in the country of Pennsylvania. Are any of you Pennsylvanians? No? If you were, you would spend your whole life in your country. You'd never set foot in the country of Maryland, or the country of Delaware, or the country of the Jerseys, or the country of New York, let alone the Ohio wilderness country. We had 13 different economies, 13 different currencies, 13 different armies. At the time of the first Congress, by the by, you do call it the First Continental Congress, do you not? We didn't call it that. We didn't know there was going to be a second one. We called it the Philadelphia Congress. But at the time of that Congress, Connecticut was at war with Pennsylvania and Virginia. 9 of the colonies had navies. We had different ways of doing everything. Can you imagine? I walk into the room, Colonel Washington from the Virginia delegation. I meet a New Englander, Mr. Adams. He stands as my vice president. Mr. John Adams walks right up to me, and he says, Colonel Washington, well, it was more like this, actually. Colonel Washington, what a great honor. He puts his hand out to me. I take a look at his hand, and I take a step back. He, being a New Englander, closes the distance with his hand out. I take another step back. Do you understand that from Maryland southward, gentlemen bow? From Pennsylvania northward, gentlemen proffer their hands. Different customs, very awkward moments. It was a miracle that we came together and accomplished anything by the by. And we agreed at that first Congress to not import goods made from Great Britain. And we agreed to come back together again a year later. It does not take a year. We are back together again 6 months later as a result of the events of April 19th, 17 and 75. Please tell me that someone here knows what happened on April 19th, 17 and 75. Say it again. You are bright as fresh paint. The battles of Concord and Lexington. British troops march on those 2 towns. They're going to arrest patriots, confiscate black powder and weaponry. They are met by armed American resistance. The war has begun. The Congress comes back in session, very full agenda. First order of business, we agree to raise up arms against our king, the most powerful fighting force in the entire world, the British Army and Navy. Second order of business, we send a petition to the king. We tell him we want to continue to be your subjects forever, but we have governed ourselves, and let us continue to do so. And by the by, we want representation in Parliament. And the king gets that petition, called the Olive Branch petition. The king, he is not amused. He sends back a very clear message. You are in rebellion. And he lets us know he will strip us of our status as loyal subjects. He will do nothing but give us justice. Be that as it may, I was the third item on the agenda. I was appointed as Commander-in-Chief of the new Continental Army of the United Colonies of America. We wouldn't declare independence for 13 more months. I was scared to death, scared to death. I wrote to Mrs. Washington. She was here at Mount Vernon. I sent her a copy of my will. She was not pleased to receive that. And I made her a promise that I would be home for Christmas Eve. I didn't tell her which Christmas Eve. I literally walked across the threshold of our home here at Mount Vernon on Christmas Eve, 8.5 years later. You know how the story ends. We as a people raised up these United States of America to make a better life for most, not all, of the inhabitants of this land. And then we had to decide what kind of country we were going to be, and make no mistake about that, because there were a wide range of options and opinions, including those ill-conceived who wanted to make me what? King. You need to understand the context of the time. At the time that we sign our Declaration of American Independence, I always call that the promise. And again, at the time that we sign our Constitution, which I always call the delivery upon this promise, we in America are the only nation on earth. I need to say that again. We are the only country on this planet that is not under the control of men and women of absolute power. Every other nation, kings, queens, lords, ladies, sheiks, viziers, caliphs, potentates, maharajas, mikados, emperors, even a tsarina. I ran out of fingers. We, for the first time in human history, raise up a nation based on ideas, constrained by laws, the Constitution of the United States of America. On the last day of that Constitutional Convention, I had dismissed everyone. I was the presiding officer. I was on the dais putting my things together, and I heard a tap, tap, tap. Dr. Franklin, the sage of Philadelphia, was walking towards me. I went off the dais. I took his arm in support. He was in pain, gout, kidney stones, and such. I said, "How can I help you, sir?" He had a crabtree walking stick with a gold Liberty Cap crown. It was his most prized personal possession. He actually left it to me when he died. He starts poking it past me. He said to me, "General, throughout these proceedings, I have been looking at your chair." I said, "My chair?" He said, "Your chair." I said, "I don't understand, doctor." He said, "General, in our day and time when a painter paints a sun on the horizon, or when a sculptor, woodcarver, carves a sun on the horizon, and I had one on my chair, carved, beautifully gilded. He said, when they do that, you can never tell if it's a rising sun or if it's a setting sun." And he said, throughout these proceedings, more than a third of a year, there has been so much faction, so much division. This union, it almost fell apart before it founded. But today we have signed this Constitution, and I have the great happiness to know that it is a rising sun on America, not a setting one. What a remarkable story, the formation of this country, and for myself, humbled to be some small part, to take a part of it. And while I am still not a scholar, I have been thrust in the role of leadership. Perseverance, sense of duty. It occurs to me that we may have a few moments, is that correct, for some questions? It would be my honor.
Yes, it's open to our great young future leaders to ask any questions.
They will be leaders if they persevere and have a sense of duty. Anyone at all? My friend? Ah, yes. All these modern inconveniences. Why don't you tell me, and I'll be happy to repeat your question. What's my opinion about political parties? I think they are the bane of the United States. You may believe that political party, while it may have use from time to time, does very little but raise the interest of the party above the nation. And typically, it will serve the self-interest of a small number of, not the nation's.
Prioritized representation based on the number of people in a state. How did you balance your duty as a Virginian and as someone of the Union?
With regard to being a citizen of a state?
Yes.
I became a citizen of the United States of America. That was a choice that I made. I believed it was an appropriate choice. I don't want to say I abandoned my country. I am a great lover of the Commonwealth of Virginia. But be that as it may, I have signed correspondence from time to time, citizen of the United States of America. It was not a question of balance. Mr. Patrick Henry had said, I am not a Virginian, but an American. Is that hand?
We have time for one more question.
One more question? Don't get this opportunity very often. My goodness gracious, not one of you is going to ask me about my teeth or geriatry or throwing a dollar across the Potomac River, all of which are myths. I beg your pardon, sir? I would be most pleased to do so. Not one of you? A brave lad. We shall see where it takes him.
You are the foremost expert on your own life. What is something that not many people know about you?
What is something that not many people know about me? I would suggest to you that if you want something that will put a smile on your face and end this small dissertation on my part with some humor, my favorite flavor of iced cream. Do you enjoy iced cream, every one of you? In Philadelphia, during the right time of year, any month that includes an R in it, you may enjoy oyster iced cream. And that is my own personal favorite. And I thank you for your great kindness. I look forward to hearing each of your stories subsequently. I hope I'm around long enough to hear them. And I remain your humble and your obedient servant. Thank you kindly.
Thank you very much, sir.
Good luck to you, madam.
Thank you. It was an honor.
I wish you joy of your citizenship and joy of your freedom.
Thank you very much.
All the best.
All right, now we have Steve Hammond. Please welcome Steve.
Good morning. Good morning. Can you hear me okay? I'll speak up a little bit as well. That's a little bit better. Well, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. I have an opportunity to talk about one of the things that I really enjoy doing. I retired about 2 years ago, and as a high school student, I got interested in genealogy, and now that I'm retired, I have a chance to pursue that all the time. And it just so happens that part of that story takes me back to Mount Vernon. And I want to spend a little bit of time with you today to tell you about two quick stories. These two gentlemen are cousins. William Syphax was born in Virginia, and Peter Joseph, my great-grandfather was born in New Orleans. So I want to start out by giving you some context. This is a condensed family tree to the family tree that you see off to your right, the family tree that was sent out to the folks that are involved in the webcast. You have a copy of the large family tree, but this is a small portion of that. And you can see the two lower circles, Peter Joseph on the right and Peter Joseph on the left and William Syphax on the right. And William's parents were Charles and Mariah Syphax. And the interesting thing there, you'll see an arrow that points to Martha Washington. Just so happens that Martha Washington was Mariah Syphax's great-grandmother. So let's take it back one step further. Family trees can reveal a lot. I don't know if you all have looked at your own family trees, but it's an interesting activity to look at. But here gives you a little bit of background about what the Custis family looks like. And you can see up at the top that while General Washington did marry Martha, he was her second husband. She was married once before. And she had a son who had a son, so her grandson was George Washington Parke Custis. He basically had a wife that he married in the early 1800s. But one of the things that we don't know a lot about is the fact that George Washington Parke Custis had a daughter with a slave here at Mount Vernon. What we don't know is whether Mariah Syphax was actually born here or born at the Arlington estate. She was born in 1803. Martha died in 1802, 1803 time frame. So about the time that she passed away and George Washington Parke Custis inherited slaves, he had a daughter. So I want to give you just a little bit of background on the milestones of William Syphax, and then we'll go into this a little bit further with a couple of examples. He was educated in private schools. He was a chief messenger at the Department of the Interior, worked for several secretaries of the Interior. I'm pretty proud of that because I worked for the Geological Survey for many years and had no idea until I got older that we would work in the same organization 100 and some odd years later. It's pretty incredible. He argued for the return of his confiscated Syphax property. We'll talk about that in a moment. He was appointed the first president of the Board of Trustees of Colored Schools in Washington, D.C. He was an advocate for education of blacks in D.C. And he, as you can see, there was a champion for black children. So let's talk about this a little bit further. One of the things that I like to do in terms of giving context with the family tree is also give context spatially. You all are from this area, so you probably have a pretty good sense of where, what we're talking about here. You can see at the bottom star is Mount Vernon, and the other stars are Alexandria moving up. We have Arlington in the upper left and Washington, D.C. in the upper right. When George Washington Parke Custis inherited slaves and property from his grandmother, who had died, he basically inherited the property at Arlington, which is now known as Arlington National Cemetery. But it served in a lot of different capacities long before it has become the burial ground for the nation's heroes. So what I'm going to show now is basically a time lapse of the Arlington estate. George Washington Parke Custis moved here in 1803. The blue dot up in the upper center shows where the Arlington House is. I don't know if you all have been to Arlington House, but that's where the house was built between 1803 and 1818. Let's see, this goes from 1826 to 1863, but I'm going to back up one step and say that when the slaves were taken to the Arlington property, they began to work the property, make it more profitable, but the Syphaxes, Mariah and Charles, grew up there. Charles was the head house slave, and Mariah was growing up alongside of his daughter. In 1825, Charles and Mariah married, and in 1826, George Washington Parke Custis actually gave her 17 acres of property at the south end of the Arlington estate. So this particular map goes from about 1863. The war has started. The property is beginning to change in terms of the military wanting to take it over. People actually were beginning to move into this area. The slaves were freed in 1803. They began to live at a freeman's village, more than 1,000 people at a time there, but thousands of people passed through this area over the course of about 30 years. It remained open from 1863 to 1890. So I'm going to move along quickly here. There was a fort that was built that basically, these gentlemen basically helped to protect the cemetery and the tombs of the unknown. Those red bars are the first locations of burials of soldiers that was right adjacent to the house. The other thing that I will say is that George Washington Parke Custis's daughter married Robert E. Lee. I don't know if you knew that or not, but married Robert E. Lee, and when the war started, he retreated to become the Confederate general for the South. But his wife also retreated. And about 1863, when taxes were due, his wife, Mary Lee, could not pay the taxes. And so the federal government basically took all of this property. So as time went on, people began to live there. That's what the yellow that you see here. And in 1866, after the property was taken, I should say that when they took the property, they also took the Syphax property because they had no proof that the property belonged to the Syphaxes. In 1866, William Syphax, Mariah's son, basically working with Congress of the United States, helped to develop a bill for the relief of Mariah Syphax. And in June of 1866, Andrew Johnson basically signed this bill, S-321, to return the property back to the family. This is what Arlington looks like today. The Syphax property is down there in the lower left-hand corner. They ultimately expanded Fort Myer, and they basically subsumed the Syphax property. The family that lived there were moved, exhumed, and moved over to Maryland. So one of the things that in terms of the tie between William Syphax and Peter Joseph is that in 1880, Peter Joseph wrote a letter to the president, Rutherford B. Hayes, requesting that his cousin be given consideration for a job in Washington, D.C. So it's amazing that two cousins more than 1,000 miles apart would know of each other. So let's talk about, in the last couple of minutes that I have, a little bit about Peter Joseph. These are some things that I wanted you to know about Peter Joseph, that he was self-taught, that he was a Civil War veteran for the Union side. He advocated for equal rights, tested the 14th Amendment, which I'll try to get to, and he basically was a presidential elector in 1876 and was bribed $1,000 to vote for Rutherford B. Hayes, or excuse me, for Tilden, Samuel Tilden, but turned that down. So Peter Joseph's mother basically was born in Virginia, but she was moved to New Orleans. We're not sure how she was moved there, but we know that she was a slave. Ultimately, she had Peter Joseph in 1842, and in 1892, he moved his family to Denver, Colorado. Peter Joseph is honored at the African American Civil War Memorial. The point that I wanted to make here is that family members can be remembered and honored in a variety of ways, and perhaps you have some examples of that in your own family. A lot can be learned from public records. One of the things I wanted to show you here is that this is Peter Joseph's military record, and you look at the highlighted piece there at the upper side there, and you can see, were you a slave? And it basically states that his father purchased his freedom when he was a child. And we know who the slave owner was, and we continue to try to find this person. Her name was Mise Cornfranz, which is a tough name to try to locate, but we can't locate her yet. Here is the Louisiana presidential electors document. This is basically found in the Library of Congress. If you have any interest, you can see Peter Joseph's signature there. And there are a number of family records that really highlight Peter Joseph's life. We have a bibliography that one of his daughters wrote, which, you know, maybe you have a bibliography or a journal that you keep about your family that might be useful. And then there's also things in papers like the obituaries. And last but not least, I wanted to just quickly show you about the 14th Amendment. Peter Joseph basically sued an Academy of Music in 1874, and he ultimately sued for $1,000 because he had to sit in a segregated location. You may have seen that he was very light-skinned, and he could not sit where the other dark-skinned people were at. So he sued. He ultimately won the case, but it was basically appealed by the Academy of Music. It went to the Louisiana Supreme Court, who upheld the case, but upheld the judgment, but they reduced the judgment to $300. So my question to you is, what is your story? And perhaps during the course of the day, you'll have questions for me, and we can talk about how you put your story together. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. First, I guess thank you for the great lecture from General Washington about the birth of this country. I personally enjoyed it very much. I hope you did too. Thank you, Washington Affairs Council, for hosting us. Thank you, George Washington Estate, for having us here. George Washington impersonator talked about the birth of this country. I want to tell you about the struggle of the Kurds for a country of their own. I have 4 slides, 4 pictures. You could think of them like a play with 4 acts, or a ladder with 4 steps, or if you're hungry for lunch, a course of meal with 4 courses of meals, like appetizer, a soup, a main course, and a dessert. The first act, the first slide is actually a joke. But I have to warn you, it's not like Stephen Colbert's jokes or Jon Stewart's jokes. It's dark humor. It comes from the Middle East. It's from the land of the Kurds. These days, if you visit Kurdistan, which is primarily in Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran, in the coffee houses, in the tea houses, you may come across this joke. There were two prisoners. Both were on a death row. One happened to be a Turk, and the other one happened to be a Kurd. As is the custom all over the world, the death row inmates are asked for their last wishes. So the guards, the angels of death, if you will, asked the Kurdish inmate, what is it that he wanted? He said, I haven't seen my mom for a long time. I'd like to see my mom, and I'm ready to kick the can to say goodbye to you all. They asked the Turkish inmate, what is it that he wanted? And here comes the punchline. He said, I don't want the Kurdish guy to see his mother. I know it's dark humor. It's what passes as comedy in the Middle East, a place where freedom of speech is on a very tight leash. Freedom of assembly is not a given. And peoples of the Middle East are struggling for greater political space, greater recognition. And so this is what passes as comedy in the Middle East. Homer and the Kurds, the second slide, the second story, the second act. Homer lived apparently 2,800 years ago. He is the author of the Odyssey and Iliad. 3,200 years ago, as you probably know from your study of history, something major happened in what's today called Turkey. There were Trojans, the city of Troy, and then there were Greeks in ancient Greece. Troy was surrounded by Greeks and then was eventually taken. And it was a big event. It became a tale. And Homer was the best of the Greeks who recounted that tale. And he has a quote, I think kind of applies to the Kurds, that I want to share with you. And the quote is this: when a people lose their freedom, male members of that society lose half of their manhood. So if you've never seen a half man, you're staring at one. I was once in Nome, Alaska, at a place called Nome, at a Chamber of Commerce, and I was giving a talk about the Kurds. And I didn't know that there were some Native Americans in the audience. I shared with them the story of Homer. And at the end of my talk, a Native American woman came to me and said, next time you relate that story to high school students or university students, you should add that the women lose everything. I promised her I would do that, and I'm doing so now. The third slide I have is of a Kurdish man, Mehdi Zana. In 70s, I was in my teens. I grew up in Turkish Kurdistan / Turkey. I was your age, and Kurdish was illegal in Turkey. And there was an election in the city of Diyarbakir, also known as Ahmet, the largest Kurdish city in Kurdistan. This gentleman wanted to become the mayor. And he did something incredible. He spoke Kurdish in spite of the ban. I was your age, as I said, and for me, that was like witnessing history in action. It was like a revolutionary act. It was kind of like your Rosa Parks moment, when Rosa Parks refused to give her seat to the white man. And this guy refused to give in to the authorities, to the Turkish authorities, to speak Turkish, to campaign to become the mayor. Years later, unfortunately, he was thrown into prison and horribly tortured. In the course of 2 years, some 58 Kurdish inmates were beaten to death. 8 months after he was imprisoned, he was asked if he wanted to see his loved ones. And he said he would like to see his mother, just like the fictional story I told you. They said, fine, we'll send the word out, we'll get your mom. But you have to know there's no Kurdish in Turkey. You have to speak to her in Turkish. Mehdi Zana didn't want to dishonor his mother. Mehdi Zana knew that his mother didn't speak Turkish, and he didn't know how to get out of it. The day of visitation came, his mother came, the guards were standing next to Mehdi Zana, and his mom walked in, anxious, curious if her son had been hurt, had been beaten, had been tortured. She noticed something odd. She noticed he wasn't speaking. She wanted to talk to him, but he just would not open his mouth. I would say she had an epiphany of sorts, and she cried, and she said, oh my God, they have beaten my son into muteness and deafness, that he cannot speak, that he cannot hear. Unfortunately, that's what our oppressors want us to be, deaf and mute. The last story is also of a Greek king, Lycurgus. He ruled Sparta 2,800 years ago. The Spartans were the ones who actually went to Troy and destroyed Troy with the Athenians. Spartans were known as an authoritarian city, and they had a custom of bringing their slaves, having them drink, and having their own children watch these drunk slaves misbehave, act foolish, so that their kids would avoid drinking. The reason I share this story with you is I am a half man. I am not free. Maybe there's a lesson for you in it. The lesson, I think, is that you should hold on to your freedoms, to your First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, with both hands, and hold on to it tight. It's very important. Maybe that's my role, to come here and to tell you that as a person who's not free, you should learn something from it. And if you would like to contribute to the freedom of the Kurds, you could go to my website, kurdistan.org. I have a declaration of conscience there that you could sign. Thank you.
Okay, that was a very, very powerful presentation. Thank you, both gentlemen, for your presentations. I want to start by asking one question that I received online, and the question is for Steve, and then we open up to the audience for their questions from both of you. Okay, I received a question from Mrs. Bird's class. I hope they are watching us. Steve, they asked, when did you become interested in your family history and how did you go about researching it? I think somebody is interested in pursuing what you are doing.
Well, thanks for that question. I got interested probably when I was in 9th grade, maybe when I was a sophomore in high school. I had an older cousin who actually had a big library, and she got me interested in geology, but she also got me interested in genealogy. And one of her goals was to keep our family together. When you look at how big that family tree is, not many people knew of each other, and one of her goals was to try to find ways to keep everybody together. So that's really what kind of got me started. And the way I started was to simply ask questions of my own family members, you know, gathering pictures, beginning to look at diaries, but then I started to get into the things like the census. And I started to realize that we had a much bigger family and there were ties back to Mount Vernon, so it meant coming to Mount Vernon and going to Arlington, going to the Library of Congress. And the great thing about that these days is all of that information is at your fingertips online. You can get to so much of that. Most of the stuff that you saw in my slide presentation were things that you can actually see online. So I would urge you to look there first.
Thank you. Any questions? Sure. Can I please ask to say your name? At least we know
Yeah,
who
sure.
is who. Thank you.
Okay, my name is Rohan, and I have a question for Connie. What is your opinion on the PKK?
PKK is an armed opposition group in Turkey, as well as now it's in Iraq, as well as in Syria. It fights through arms for the rights of the Kurds.
My name is Star, and my question is for David. I'm sorry, Steve. My apologies. So, as we have learned in school in psychology class, that if you go back into certain family systems, that you can see that some are really similar to the ones that you are experiencing present in the current day and stuff. And I was curious if, when you were peeling back some of the layers and stuff, and you were looking at previous relatives and their family systems, did you see that any ones were similar to yours or anything like that?
If you look at Peter Joseph's story, I think it mimics a lot about what's going on today in terms of civil rights. When you look at the ability to be
Steve, can you please speak up?
a little bit.
Thank you.
Is that better? Okay. If you look at the fact that he was a presidential elector in 1876, and you look at what we just went through in terms of our election and the impact that happened when Reconstruction ended, and all the things that were going on with Louisiana and separatism and all of those things, there were just so many things that kind of really made me even more interested to learn more and compare history then with what's going on today.
Thank you very much. Now we go for our next presenter, Indra. Thank you, both gentlemen. Yes, please.
Well, thank you. When I first met General Washington in the other room, I was thinking what you would say if he had seen me back in the day. He would probably look at me and be like, I've never heard of any man who's a Bhutanese American, but let me tell you this. I am surrounded by former refugees who will be building this nation where you'll be living. And I was thinking about it because I myself am a former refugee. I was born, raised in a refugee camp, and came to the US 4.5 years ago, soon to be 5, because I'll be a citizen then. And living in this country at this time, I don't want to get too political, but it is not about politics, it's more about my own existence in this country. It feels a bit challenging, but in the meantime, it is a country that I love, and I think my story will present the narrative of Americans, because whenever we think of Americans, we have certain narrative of certain color, certain background and whatnot. But as a proud American, as I identify myself, I do believe that we have different narratives that are to be told and that are to be heard by people. So the first memory of my life, that's where I want to start. The first thing that I learned about myself was, or the first thing that I thought about myself was that I was living in hell. While growing up, did you guys hear about the story of heaven and hell? What happens when you die? Heaven is all this flowery stuff, and angels are around you. But in the hell, you don't have food to eat, you don't have place to live. There is heat, there are satans that are trying to kill you and whatnot. That was the reality that I lived, because whenever I think about my past, I can think back to when I was 4 years old. And the first thing that I know is that, I didn't have food to eat. I didn't have clothes. I had to depend on other people giving me clothes. When I put on my suit these days, I say, I have gone so far in my life. And not from the sense of, ego or, just trying to brag about myself. But the journey that I have taken reminds me that, life is amazing, regardless of what happens. So my parents were exiled from the kingdom of Bhutan because of ethnic cleansing. And I don't want to take a lot of time, but I go on public speaking tour throughout the country. And whenever I ask people like what they know about Bhutan, the first thing that comes out of their mouth is the happiest country on earth. But that's not how I look at Bhutan at all. Because all I know is the country, the government killed people, they exiled, my people, and my mom was pregnant when she had to run away from the country, and I was born in refugee camp. The first memory of my life was not having a place, not having clothes to wear, not having food to eat, and having local people from Nepal, constantly try and kill us. And even now, I have what I call moral injury. I don't like to, medicalize that term. But, whenever I wake up because of nightmare, what happened is I see these local young folks just like me trying to drown me, trying to kill me, just because I was a refugee. And that identity as a whole played a role in my entire life. So growing up, it was a constant challenge, and I call it the constant challenge for existence, for survival. It was not only about not having food to eat, not having clothes to wear, and I emphasize on those because food, clothes, and shelter, those are really important for your existence. It was not only about those, it was about lack of recognition, lack of understanding by other people. When you're labeled refugee, you are just not a human being. You're just a number. And I was one of the number. They didn't know my name. There was no official record of my existence. And whenever I tried to leave the refugee camp, people would try and kill us, like because we were refugees. They thought that we were illegally occupying their place, when in fact it was not illegal occupation, but rather taking a refuge or living in exile. So I grew up with 3 of my amazing siblings, and my dad, constantly struggled because he had, the thing called PTSD, or I call it moral injury. And my mom, amazing woman, she made me feminist. That's what I say. She doesn't like the term, but I like it, so I call her the feminist mom. She really worked hard to raise us, 3 of us. She would carry us around when she was trying to go to school. And living in refugee camp, I had a different childhood from the childhood that I've seen in America. And, every single night before I went to bed, I wondered whether or not I would be alive the next day. And that was the sad reality that I had to live through. You have a hut made from bamboo and thatch where you can see the sky. It is amazing. I don't know if you guys love stargazing. I fell into the love of stargazing because I was forced to see the sky because there was no roof, right? When you lay down on a bed, so-called bed, made up of mud, you see the stars there. And whenever I looked at the sky, I asked myself, will I be alive in the morning? Because there is a possibility that I could die of malnutrition. I haven't eaten enough in a long time, and I've eaten mud in a few days. You guys might feel like it is disgusting. It was disgusting, but that was the only way to survive. My parents worked really hard to support us. There was UNHCR giving us food, but it was not enough. So I asked myself whether or not I would be alive the next day. And when I got up in the morning, I said, thank God I'm still alive. I am not super religious, but I do believe in spirituality. And even until today, before I go to bed, I say, thank you, God. It was an amazing day, and I'm still alive. And when I wake up in the morning, I say, thank you, God. I'm still alive. Many people wondered if I was so depressed. Whenever people ask me, how are you? I say, I'm still alive. How are you? And people think that I'm depressed. It is not a sign of depression. It is a sign of my existence. It is a sign of my pride. So, fast forward, we don't have a lot of time, but refugee camp, there are different situations. It was a constant struggle. But when I came to the US through refugee resettlement program that we are thinking of, somehow banning or whatever, I don't want to get too deep into that. We can have a different conversation about it. But I came to the US through the refugee resettlement program, and when I first came here, I took a breath and I said, I'm free. I have an ID that says I'm Indra, that I'm a human being, I'm not a number anymore. And I was happy that, I was in this country and I love this country to death, but we do have our own problems, right? And I went to high school. I was not an AP student, let me be clear. I was not that smart. Or I went to college instead in my high school senior year. I didn't take AP, IB. They didn't have that AP, IB courses in my high school, the high school that I went to. When I went to high school, I was labeled a terrorist. A high school junior was a troublemaker. I'll be honest, I'm a troublemaker from when I was a kid. If I see something wrong, I'm not gonna be quiet and just look at it. I was a troublemaker from when I was a kid, and whenever I saw some incidents of racism, blah, 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 I spoke up. And, based on how society perceive us, we have this internal biases where if you hear someone, with an accent, a former refugee coming into the US and talks about criticizing the systemic racism to, all these things, who could it be? A terrorist. So I had to go to my principal's office, get my entire body searched, even take off my shoes in America, and even get my, fruit snacks tear apart, just so that, they could see whether or not there was bum in there, for heaven's sake. And then only then I was allowed to go to class. It happened for about 30 days, and then I said, enough is enough. And I said, listen, if you want to continue this, we're going to do this in the court. And finally, I had a godmother, who was the city manager of the time, who helped me in that process. And the journey was great after that. I went to college because I didn't want to go to the same high school that thought I was a terrorist. I went to college for my high school senior year. And then finally, I got into Georgetown, which is not that far from here. And I studied there. I work in the national politics. Just to give some background, I speak at different events throughout the country. I'm engaged in progressive politics, so I'm biased, yes. I work in a presidential campaign for Senator Sanders, reaching out to students and youth throughout the country. I was helping him, and now, I work at the Jeju Refugee Service. I have helped different politicians to, talk about the immigration, refugee, and education bills and whatnot. And this summer, I will be working back in Vermont, helping my community. I was recently hired as a project manager, and I'll be looking at the effect of 2016 presidential election on the members of the community and what it means for Vermont students. So that's what I'll be doing. And it's been a terrific journey. Like, being born at a place where I had no food to eat, no place to live, no bed, where I was constantly worried about whether or not I would be alive the next day, to being at a place where I can advocate for many people throughout the country, throughout the world. It's been a terrific journey, and I'll tell you this, regardless of where you are, build a positive narrative. You are amazing, you are powerful, and you can do it. I believe in each of you. Go set the world in fire. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, our next amazing presenter today, Maria Loza.
Not that button. Let me figure this out for 1 second. That's the one I didn't get right. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself before we start with the slides. My name is Mireya Loza. I have a doctorate in American Studies from Brown University, and I'm a curator at the National Museum of American History. Have y'all been to the National Museum? Yes? Okay, just checking. So, before I became a curator, my sort of love of history began as, a youngster. I grew up in Chicago. My parents are immigrants, Mexican immigrants. And I lived in a city where, although a lot of Latinos live there, I didn't feel like I had a history there. I didn't know that I had a history there. When I got to undergrad, my teacher at one point said to me, and to the entire class, find your oldest family member and carry out an oral history. And my oldest family members weren't that old because my oldest family members are in Mexico. So my oldest family member was my uncle, who I saw every single day and who I knew had been a Bracero. And so I carried out my oral history, and I didn't know that that moment would be linked to the rest of sort of the trajectory of my career. I went on to graduate school, and as soon as I set foot on my campus, in my program, several people had said to me, "Do you want to work with the National Museum of American History? They're working on a giant collecting project documenting the story of braceros. Don't you have a family member or family members that were braceros?" And I was like, "Yes, the bracero story is my family story." So how many of you know what the bracero program was? You do? What? What is the bracero program? Yep. Anybody else can add? No? Okay, no takers. So, the Bracero program is a binational agreement between the U.S. and Mexico, which allowed Mexican male laborers to enter the U.S. on temporary work permits from 1942 to 1964. 1942, war. They came in because they're needed as people who are fulfilling jobs or filling jobs in industries like railroad and agriculture that have been hit hard by war. Now, as you can tell, it lasts longer than the war. The railroad component stops fairly quickly, and the agricultural component booms, in part because a lot of historians says that there was a perceived labor shortage brought on by World War II, but afterwards, agriculture became so dependent on low-wage, deportable labor. Over 4.5 million contracts were issued. This is a moment where America actually asked Mexicans to come in. So they asked, we're not talking about 1, 2, 20, 30, 40, 50. We're talking about 4.5 million contracts. So you want to see what that looks like? That's what a contracting station looks like. Again, not 12. This is a moment of American history that contradicts many of the logics about immigration that are currently popular, right? 4.5 million contracts, they were brought in, predominantly male, or all male, I should say. You go to the contracting station, you wait for your name to be called, people check your hands, you get processed, you wait for a contract, you get stripped down, you get sprayed with DDT so that you can get your contract. You make your way to the California fields. This is what you do. You can make your way to Texas. You can make your way to a lot of places. You can make your way to the state of Washington. You can make your way to Nebraska. You can even make your way at the beginning to Baltimore and work on the railroad, okay? So these men walked around not so far from here. If you work in agriculture, this is what a typical barrack would look like in Southern California. Southern California is shifting. It's becoming industrialized agriculture. So what it means is that there's not these little tiny farms owned by one person, but conglomerates, giant companies, buying swaths of land and industrializing this. So they need lots and lots of laborers. Prior to this period, you could find more diverse workforce. You can find folks from Oklahoma, Arkansas. You could find Filipinos. You can find all types of people working agriculture. But what happens in this moment is that agricultural work becomes some of the least sought after work, right? So what does the National Museum want to do at this period? The National Museum collects these beautiful images from this photographer, Leonard Nadell. You know, they bring on people like myself and lots of other folks, and they ask, how can we capture these men's stories? Because the documents don't tell us the whole story. We have government documents that don't tell us who these men actually are and what their stories are. So we decide to go out into the field, to go out into, California, again, New Mexico, Texas, into Mexico as well, to collect the story of these men and to document the story of these men and their families, brothers, sisters, anybody who worked alongside these men. And we decide that bracero history is everyone's history. And if you danced with a bracero for a nickel, in 1943, we want your story. If you were a sharecropper that worked alongside braceros or new braceros, we took your story. So we built a gigantic repository of bracero stories. Won the 2010 prize, right? Gigantic, over 800 oral histories. Over 800 oral histories, right? That's a lot of oral histories. And from that, we also built a traveling exhibition. It opened up in 2009, and it was devoid of objects when it traveled, just these panels. 2009. Do you think it was popular? What's your guess? You're going to say it's an obscure period of American history? That's what we heard. It's an obscure period in American history. Who's going to want to know? Within 2 weeks, Sites, who sends out the promotional material of these exhibitions, in 2 weeks, the first exhibition was completely booked, and they created another exhibition to travel simultaneously. 2009, it's 2017, and it is still traveling and will continue traveling for the next 2 years. What we found is that people do want to learn about this history, and lots of communities connect to this history. This is part of their history. So places in Nebraska, places in California, places in, around the corner from here took on this exhibition. And what we learned is that, we can tell fantastic stories about American history if they're grounded in people. If you can see the people's stories, if you can see who we're talking about, and if we can stop seeing these people as just one horde of everyone is the same and start looking at individual stories. And that's what the Oral History Project allowed us to do. Oral history allowed us to tell the story of one man who went. He worked in Baltimore, the railroad line. And on Sunday, he decided to go right in front of the Capitol with his friend and take a portrait of himself in front of the Capitol. And what did we do? We collected the object, we showed it in the exhibition, and we told the story of adventure and also of hard labor. And so, in many ways, this exhibition has not only allowed us to talk about this very unique period in American history, but it's allowed us to talk about this shift in migration so that people like my father, who followed in the footsteps of his brother, who was a Bracero, but he came in as an undocumented worker, are inextricably linked to this program, right? What happens when you bring millions and millions of people over? Well, sometimes they want to bring their brother. Sometimes they want to see if they can, figure out a way to stay and bring their other family members. And this, again, disturbs this logic, and it allows us to tell personal stories on a national stage. So I'm happy to answer any questions, and I know we're moving into the question and answer period.
And please have a seat. And I want to ask everybody in the audience to keep your questions short because we have many questions. And I'm going to start by asking one question from Indra and then open it to the audience. Okay, from John L. Did your struggle for survival help you appreciate your life now? If so, how?
I don't know if I would say, it helped me appreciate my life now, but I would say it helped me appreciate my life in general. Like, not only the life that I have now, but even the life, that I had then. Because there are two sides to the same story. When I was struggling not having food to eat, when I was struggling not having clothes to, wear, I still had a sense of community. People were working together with us. We had a strong sense of family. We had a strong sense of, brotherhood and sisterhood within the community. And I appreciated that. So, like, my struggle helped me understand the complexity of life, the complexity of, struggles that people may have throughout the world. But in the meantime, it helped me appreciate whatever I have, whenever there are times when I have to travel constantly for my, for the events, and if I don't get to eat like for 12 hours, I'll be like, man, I didn't eat for 3 days. I'll be fine not eating for, 12 hours now. So yeah, it helped me appreciate my life and the struggles that, a lot of people have throughout the world.
Very good. Thank you very much. I have another question for you that comes from our online audience, and a question from Mr. Morin's class. What is the most rewarding part of being a museum curator?
I think the most rewarding part is being able to tell these stories.
Speak up, please.
Oh, the most rewarding part for me is going to meet regular people that don't really see their history as something that should be elevated to the importance of national history, and convincing them that their story is important and letting me bring their story back to the museum is an amazing feeling. Finding folks that, have something like an ID from this program, or my favorite was a man from the Yucatan who had a radio. And I said to him, we want to tell the story of migration and how the technology you took back also changed your village. And he said to me, young woman, the radio doesn't work. Why do you want it? I said, at the National Museum, we're not going to use it to DJ a party. We're going to use it as an object, and we are going to display it and tell your story. And he gladly gave it to us. And that's probably those are the most rewarding experiences, finding folks that never see themselves in national history and sort of explaining to them that they are important and it is a national story.
All right, any question? Keep your questions short, but we have many, many.
I'm Will. I was wondering, this is actually something either or both could answer, but our current national discourse is kind of dominated by isolationism. How can we change that? How can we work to change that?
I think for me, the way we can work to change that is to teach history. I think, the humanities are, an area that is really under attack right now. And the humanities allow us, and history allows us, to see our stories and see how they're linked and see how they're different. And so for me, when I tell the story of Braceros, and at one point, for the project, we went down to Arkansas and started uncovering stories of African Americans who worked alongside Braceros, and to say these stories are inextricably linked. And there's something that ties us together, both in the past and in the present, is powerful.
And I mean, in addition to the history, I think having meaningful conversations is important because I have traveled throughout the country for, like political stuff and whatnot. And I've been told, I've had people who, walk straight up to me and they say, I don't like you, man. I've had people say that to me. And whenever I have those people, say those things to me, what I say is, you're amazing. Let's have a conversation. Let's have a conversation because I am not the narrative that's been presented out in the media. I am not the narrative, I don't fit into the stereotype that you have in your mind. Your struggle, if you're a white man living in Appalachia who think that immigrants are a problem in this country, as a person who did not have healthcare all my life, I understand the struggle of your decaying tooth because I understand that the lack of healthcare is doing you a lot of damage because I did not have healthcare throughout my life. I understand the struggle of you working in the coal mine because when my dad didn't have anything to, feed us, what he did is he worked in the coal mine just so that he could, feed my family. So we can come from different parts of the world. We can, believe in the narrative that's been presented in the media. But as human, we have a common foundation that we can talk to one another. We have common struggles that we face. We love this country to death, equally. So I think if we can have open conversation, it would be great. And I have had those experiences where, at first people didn't like me, but later down the road, they allowed me to drink milk, that they just got from their cows back in Vermont. And I have become best friends with those people. Like, we don't agree on different issues, but we love one another.
Any more question here? If not, I have many online. Okay, I ask one from Maria. From John L. About how long are each of the oral histories?
They range, actually. They range a great deal. In some sites, we got hit so hard. In San Jose, we told men, and we actually had appointments. We had an appointment book. And many of these men, we started at 8 a.m., and our site manager called at 7 o'clock in the morning and said, you have to get down here. These men just started arriving and lining up. They just started arriving and lining up. They didn't care about their appointment. They just wanted and were anxious to tell their story, and were happy to tell it. And so in places like that, where we got hit hard, we might have oral histories that are 30 to 45 minutes, and in other sites we had oral histories that were an hour and a half. Our rule of thumb was never to turn anyone away, never. We would work, 10, 12 hours as long as we needed to document every story, and we used undergrads, graduate students as collaborators to come in and work with us to document these stories. And it was an eye-opening experience for young people because young people, were given a chance to create original historic documents for people who had never had their story told. And so many of them went on to graduate school, law school, to do amazing things because they felt as if they could be agents of change.
Thank you. Any question? No. Okay. Indira, I have one for you. One of our online audience, I'm not sure, was it fate that led you through your experiences in life?
That's a tough question. But I would say, I don't think so. It was not the fate. Our life is surrounded by systems, be it family system, be it the system of discipline within you, or the national system. It was my family that had a system of loving one another. So even when my mom was running through jungle, when she was pregnant with me in her stomach, she kept me alive. Even when she was raising 3 of the kids with no enough food, I never had malnutrition. Why? Because there is the love, motherly love within her that allowed her to keep me safe and alive. And I had a protection in refugee camp because we have the UN that provides protection to refugees. So that system allowed me to be safe within the refugee camp, camp, and the system within the US that we designed a long time ago. Even before this country was established, of allowing refugees to come in. It was the system that allowed me to come here and be where I am today. So I don't think it was the fate, but it was rather the system that we designed together, the system that keeps us together as human beings in the world. So yeah, I'm not a big believer in fate, no.
Thank you very much. Last question. What element of history do you think tells us the most?
I think it's hard because I've dedicated a lot of my sort of, time to oral history, but I think oral history is fantastic when you have few documents. And there are many communities that produce very few documents so that you don't have primary sources to tell their stories. So I love the fact that oral history allows us to create those documents and do something. Now, the issue with oral history is that there are some time periods where you don't have people alive anymore, and you have to rely on a written record, images, or even material culture. And by material culture, I mean, reading actual objects to tell stories, reading objects as artifacts to tell the stories of communities, of families that, again, didn't leave a written record.
Thank you very much, both. Can we please have them? Round of applause. All right, I think this was pretty amazing, like an eye-opening experience, at least for me. I'm sure in all of their stories, at least there was one thing that we all learned, and we will take it with us today. And now, last part, apparently I have to present something, and I'm sure, or maybe I should say, I hope that you guys here and those online have read my bio. So very quick. My name is Yegane. Oh, I think I was supposed to say that at the beginning. You can call me Yegi, very short. I'm from Iran, born Muslim because Iran is a Muslim country in the Middle East. And what else? I married the only American journalist who was working in Iran at the time. And we both ended up in prison for some weird reasons that we are not sure about yet. Thank God, now we are here, both safe and sound. And I want to know if you have any questions. So just start throwing questions at me rather than I tell the story. And I'm sure there will be questions online. We have 10 minutes, and I answer all kinds of personal and professional questions about Iran-US relations, about the nuclear negotiating deal that was signed a few months ago, a year and 2 months ago, about being a woman journalist, anything. All right, first question.
So my question is, after living in solitary confinement, do you have a greater appreciation for human interaction?
Oh, I think I have a greater appreciation for every second of life. When you are confined in such a small place for hours and days and months, I was in solitary. I was in prison for 72 nights, and 69 of it was solitary. You get out, and everything tastes different. Everything looks different. You take a warm shower, and you feel like, oh God. life is so simply beautiful. I definitely relate to the stories that Indra told today. Um, they fed us in prison, but not a very great food. So yes, solitary. Anybody who designed solitary confinement, I maybe purposefully or just mistakenly did it so strong. It has been designed to break people down, and I hope there is a day that prison and basically solitary is totally banned in the whole world. The human beings can communicate with each other in better ways, but it's a very, very horrifying experience. Next, yes.
What does the recent election of Rouhani mean for the future of Iran?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
So what does the recent election of President Rouhani mean for the future of Iran?
Well, I think Middle East is a very complicated place, and Iran strategically and geopolitically is even more weird than the rest of the Middle East because it's the only Shia country among lots of Sunni Muslim countries, and the rest of those countries are U.S. allies, and having Israel in the region adds to the whole level of complexity. I think he has done a decent job in his first term. I hope he keeps doing international openness, which is very important for people of Iran because they do not have enough platform to be heard internationally. What we see in news from Iran is very different from traveling to Iran. Unfortunately, for better or worse, it has been misrepresented, as I said, right or wrong. Now I have one question. Somebody asked me from Buffalo, New York, have you been able to forgive the people who imprisoned you? Forgiveness is a very strong word and is a very strong practice. I think deep down I'm still angry because I believe both me and my husband were absolutely innocent. Just being journalist or him being an American, it's none of them are crimes. Mm, I'm working on it, honestly. I'm trying because I love my country and now I love my new country as a new immigrant. So I'm trying to create a balance and forgive those people.
What barriers did you face? What barriers did you face as a woman journalist in Iran?
That's a very good question. First of all, being a woman in a very patriarchal, misogynistic country by itself is an everyday challenge. But at the same time, becoming a journalist also add another layers to all of those challenges. There are moments that you simply believe, oh, because of your gender, your whole identity is being questioned. But at the same time, sometimes you feel like, oh, as a woman, I have access to part of the nation, like half of the nation, that have been always so little mentioned or so little presented. And I should say, instead of barriers, for me, that was always very rewarding because I remember my husband, as a man, wanted to go and report some stories and he wanted to talk to women, and it wasn't so easy to communicate with women. So he was always taking me with him, and that was always giving me a very powerful voice, and I was always really appreciative of being able to communicate with part of half of the nation that has always been kept quiet. So, but challenges, I think, they are not uniquely about Iran. Even sometimes here in the Western world, I see that there's still some gender problems, and everything is not as equal as we would love it to be. Um, yes, like I can say the biggest challenge is most of you have heard in the news is that in Iran wearing headscarf and covering your body is mandatory. That's the first challenge that you learn to deal with since you're 7 years old as a girl and you want to go to school. You have to cover yourself. But through the years, I've learned that's the smallest challenge. It's the most conspicuous one, but it is not the worst one because when you want to pursue some education and they say, oh, as a woman, you cannot study, for example, nuclear science. Not that I was interested in it, but for those of them who were, a few years ago they banned. Or, for example, a few months ago they said women cannot bicycle around the city. Or very little trivial stuff that when they get in your way are they become very huge. And here I am in America. There's nothing that can stop me as a woman. One more question, if it is quick. Yes? No, at some point, at this point, I'm here for 16 months and I have not been traveling back to Iran. I don't know if officially I am able to or not. I hope I am because, as I said earlier, I love America, um, but that's also home. So I hope I am able to travel back. One more question, last. I'm sure there are many, many questions online. I'm sorry that we do not have time for those. Yes?
Hi. So earlier you mentioned that Iran was misrepresented in like media and such. What is something you can say or something that you would do to better represent Iran on the world stage?
Okay, I should say that I know that the political relations between the two countries has not been that beautiful or warm, but if any of you travel to Iran as tourists or part of some delegations, people will come to you, and as soon as they find out that you are Americans, they're like, ah, Americans, we love you. Please, when you go back, tell that Iranian people do not have problems with American people. We don't even have problems with the American government. It's the two governments that have problem. So Iranian people, I can say, are very, very hospitable, and uh, they believe they have more in common with American people than any other nation. I don't know. It's because of they have so much love and passion for this beautiful, mysterious land of opportunities, or is it because they see some similarities? I can see some similarities, and one of them is that Americans are very family oriented, exactly like Iranians. Or they are very passionate about their traditions or their history and their cultures. That's exactly like Iranians. Iranians are always so passionate and they are boastful and they are constantly bragging about their 1,000 years of history and being the great Persia. Or anything else? Any question? Okay. So I have to tell you that this experience has been amazing for me today, and somehow I believe I learned more than anybody in this room because everything has been so great. I should say that as an Iranian who grew up in a Muslim country, and in the troubled Middle East, we are one of the countries that, as Connie said, we have a big group of native Kurdish population in our country, and somehow even my family believes that we have some Kurdish roots. I don't know if that's true or not, I hope. But his story and talking about the struggles of Kurdish people was so eye-opening for me. Stephen, as an Iranian and as a new immigrant, I want you to know that I've learned so much, and I know that all of us, white, black, men, women, have so many historical stories that are really helpful to learn. I hope I have the stamina to go back and learn about my family tree. That's a major work. I admire your work, and I have to say, Maria, as a new immigrant, also trying to find out about my life and learn more about, as I said, this great land of opportunities. It was so amazing to hear about what you have done for Mexicans. I hope there is a research about Iranians coming to America at some point. And of course, Indira, your story was so inspiring. And I'm sure we all learned from all of them. If there is any question, if there is any comment, no, such great students. Thank you very much. Let's give another round of applause to all of our great. Thank you very much.